They laughed at her from behind the feed counter, the way people do when they think their cruelty won't echo. Sarah Carson, in her worn denim jacket and faded work boots, had come for fencing staples and barley seed, but they saw only someone poor, plain, and out of place. A clerk called her ma'am with a smirk, and another muttered something about locals knowing when they weren't wanted. She said nothing, just signed the receipt, turned, and walked out into the cold morning air with the kind of stillness that made their mockery feel small. Hours later, she found a noose swaying in the center of her barn, carved words behind it reading, "Time to go. Girl." She looked at it for a long time, her hands unmoving, her eyes unreadable. Then she closed the barn door, locked it from the outside, and began serving breakfast like it was any other day. Because Sarah Carson didn't leave when threatened, she fortified. The road into town was lined with frost, the kind that clings low to the ground and makes everything look suspended in time. Her truck rattled over the gravel like a stubborn heartbeat. Lucas sat beside her, sketching a schematic in a torn notebook with quiet focus. A drone design. She'd already seen him revise 4 times. He didn't ask why the men in the feed store wouldn't look her in the eye. He didn't ask why they smirked when she paid in cash. But he saw it, the way children always do. Afterward, they stopped at the gas station on the edge of the ridge. A man in a faded camouflage jacket leaned against the ice machine, cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't move when she stepped out to pump diesel. He just stared, his gaze drifting from her back window sticker to her son, then to the mud on her boots. Not a glance, but a long, unbroken stare like she was some animal he couldn't place. She didn't break stride. He didn't speak. And that silence was heavier than any words he might have used. By the time they reached the barn, the morning mist had burned off. But the air felt tight, like something had settled over the land. The doors hung slightly open, a detail Sarah noticed immediately because she never left them that way. She told Lucas to stay in the truck. He didn't argue. Inside, light spilled through the slats in long golden stripes, and in the center, the noose hung from a beam like an accusation. The rope was rough, old, already frayed, but freshly tied. On the pine behind it, someone had carved the threat deep into the wood with a hunting knife. Sarah didn't touch it. She didn't flinch. She walked back out into the light and shut the barn behind her. Later, she cracked eggs and poured juice without a tremor in her hand, her face unreadable while Lucas sat across from her and watched. The words still echoed in her head, but she moved, as if they hadn't landed. Not yet. The wind had picked up by then, brushing through the dry grass and over the fencing like breath over bone. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something was shifting, and Sarah felt it. Sarah Carson lived on the outer edge of Copperfield Ridge, where the paved roads thinned into gravel and the wind moved more freely through the fields. Her house, a square-built farmhouse with weathered shutters and a tin roof, sat back from the road behind 2 rows of cedar and a fence she repaired every spring. Most mornings started the same strong black coffee poured into a chipped ceramic mug, a scan of the western pasture, and a quiet count of the goats, which she never spoke aloud. Routine was its own kind of armor. At 37, Sarah moved like someone who'd spent years memorizing terrain. Her hands bore the marks of labor, fingers calloused from decades of fencing and cold mornings spent splitting wood. Her jacket smelled faintly of grease and pine sap. She kept her hair tied back, and her voice low but decisive. Most in town mistook her silence for awkwardness, but it wasn't that. She simply didn't waste words. People in Ashwood County didn't know much about her, only that she'd returned after her husband's death and kept to herself. Some said she used to work logistics for the Army. Others said she ran a machine shop out west. The truth, that she had served 12 years as a SEAL sniper. was something she kept locked away like the rifle case beneath her floorboards. Her son, Lucas, was 16 and taller than she expected him to be. He had her eyes but his father's quiet mouth. Mornings before school, he sat at the kitchen table sketching drone designs into a spiral notebook, one he never let out of his sight. His lines were precise, his questions technical. He wanted to fly machines, ideas, anything that got off the ground. He never said it out loud, but she knew he planned to join the Air Force. Not for war, but for wonder. They lived simply, but not without dignity. Sarah wore clean flannel and heavy jeans. Her boots were scuffed but intact, laces knotted with care. Their pantry was stocked, if modestly, and she made most meals from what grew in the field or clucked in the coop. There was no TV. Just an old radio that played local weather reports and Lucas's playlist of blues guitar and synthwave. The internet came from a battered dish she adjusted manually when storms knocked it sideways. At school, Lucas kept to himself, polite but observant. He didn't join clubs or sports teams. The guidance counselor called Sarah in once, suggesting Lucas needed social development. She'd said he was designing a functional UAV with recycled parts. The counselor called that unrealistic, when Sarah challenged a textbook's reference to battlefield optics politely. But with first-hand knowledge, she was labeled difficult. On her next visit, the secretary handed her a behavior report without meeting her eyes. In town, things were no softer. At the bank, the teller spoke slowly, as if Sarah might misunderstand basic terms. When she applied for a loan to repair the barn roof, the manager gave a tight smile and said collateral was a concern. Sarah had brought deeds, receipts, even her grandfather's original survey maps, inked by hand. They glanced at the pages but didn't flip them. She thanked them anyway, because gratitude, like survival, had been trained into her early. Her grandfather, Walter Carson, had settled the land in 1956, building the house from local pine and steel salvaged from a decommissioned rail yard. He taught Sarah to walk the fence line at dusk, how to check the wire tension by hand, how to spot a clean break from a chew mark. He gave her the fence post hatchet when she was 12. She still carried it in the back of the truck, the handle worn smooth by use. The land had been passed to her father, then to her. When her husband died 6 years ago, she buried him beneath the eastern sycamore and never left. They didn't have much, but what they had was protected. Sarah ran maintenance on her own generator. She wired motion lights into the tree line herself. She patched the barn roof with salvaged tin and ran livestock fencing from post to post without needing help. Not because she was stubborn, but because she knew the land didn't give extra points for intention. It only listened to action. Some days, at twilight, Lucas would walk the edge of the pasture with her. They didn't talk much. He'd mention a motor problem or ask about signal drift. She'd nod, suggest a different voltage regulator, and they'd walk on. It wasn't affectionless. It was just built into the space between them, steady and unshaken. To the people in Copperfield Ridge, Sarah Carson was a woman who kept to herself, worked hard, and didn't smile much. To those who looked a little closer, she was the kind of person who had built her life brick by brick and could do it again if needed. She didn't care if they underestimated her. She just hoped they wouldn't make the mistake of thinking the land was empty. It started with wire, not torn, but sliced, clean through. Sarah found it just after dawn, walking the western perimeter with a thermos in one hand and the cold biting through her flannel. The line had been cut near the slope by the creek, a spot hidden from the house and the main road. No hoof prints, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just a straight incision, surgical and recent. She didn't say anything to Lucas over breakfast. He asked if she was going to fix it, and she nodded. But her mind was already 2 steps further, wondering who had the tools, who knew the terrain, and why they'd chosen that line. She drove into town later that morning, stopping at the county records office, where the air always smelled faintly of toner and old coffee. The clerk didn't look up when she walked in, just gestured toward the wall of filing cabinets like she was a regular nuisance. She didn't mind. Familiarity was easier to work around than curiosity. She scanned property transfers first, a list of deeds recorded over the past 2 years. Nothing flagged at first. But when she filtered by names, she recognized farmers, school volunteers, people whose trucks used to park outside the diner. It became clear. 6 parcels, all owned by families who had held land for decades, all sold in less than a month after a fire, a disappearance, or a structural issue. None were listed as foreclosures. All were categorized as redevelopment opportunities. She jotted names and dates on a notepad, drawing red circles on a printout map she folded into quarters. When she matched the listed buyers to mailing addresses, the pattern turned colder. 2 had been purchased by a firm called LSP Rural Holdings, another by Sunvale Group, but the paperwork was nearly identical, same format, same language, same formatting quirks. The notarizations came from the same law office in a neighboring county. She copied the documents using the office's slow, half-jammed scanner and thanked the clerk on the way out. He didn't reply. Before heading home, she drove through Ridge Hollow, a small community that used to be thick with corn and kids playing in yards. Now the signs were subtle but unmistakable. The Wilkins place sat boarded up, the mailbox leaning at a tilt. The Clark's old field had gone to seed, a "for sale by appointment only" sign posted with no phone number. She pulled over in front of a yellow house she remembered from school fundraising drives. It was hollow now, the porch sagging, the windows dusted from the inside. No dogs barked, no wind chimes stirred, no footprints led away from the door. Not abandoned, erased. The silence wrapped around her as she sat behind the wheel. The truck's engine idled, and she kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, but her eyes flicked across the homes like a sniper scanning for glass. She knew what coordinated erasure looked like. It was never noisy. It didn't march in with flags or threats. It crept. It softened the edges until people started doubting their own memories, until the town forgot who had lived where, and for how long. That night, she spread the documents across her kitchen table, smoothing the map flat with the base of her mug. Lucas asked what she was looking at, and she told him. Patterns. He didn't press further. He just brought her the red pen she always used for fencing plans and went back to his drawings. She marked each lost farm. Then she circled the shared details fire, relocation, legal reclassification. The words were like code written to be ignored. In one of the scanned packets was a flyer folded into the back of a deed transfer, a rural development summit held last fall 2 towns over. The language was thick with slogans: preserve the future, strategic stewardship, land legacy partnerships. She scanned past the photos of smiling families and greenery until she found a name tucked at the bottom. Garrett Flynn, consultant, land security and transition services. She'd seen that name once before, years ago, in an after-action report from a deployment she never spoke about. Former private contractor, specialized in foreign asset consolidation. Now here he was again, repackaged in khakis and language meant to soothe. Sarah folded the map and the documents into a single file, sealed it with a clip, and placed it in the drawer where she kept her old field notes. Her face was calm, but her hand hovered an extra second before closing the wood. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't a local threat. It was a pattern, and someone had marked her land for removal, not with force, not yet, but with the same quiet tools that had cleared every name off that street. not for revenge, for investment, not to destroy the land, but to erase its story. She looked out the window into the dark, where the barn lights flickered against the frost, the cut wire, the silence in town, the names on her map. They weren't mistakes. They were moves. She just hadn't realized until now that she was already on the board. The cellar was colder than she remembered, the concrete floor breathing up through her boots as Sarah knelt beside the far wall and brushed away the layer of sawdust she'd scattered years ago. The key was still where she'd left it, taped behind a loose floor plank, marked with a nail scratch only she could recognize. She unlocked the trunk without ceremony, lifting the lid with both hands, and the hinges let out a low, familiar groan. Inside, the rifle waited. It was a custom M4 matte black, stripped of decoration, but every piece tuned for silence and precision. She checked the action first, then the suppressor, then unfolded the stock and laid it across the bench like a sacred object. The scope needed a light polish and such, and the grip had worn slightly since her last use. She worked through each part methodically, not for nostalgia but necessity. Oil, cloth, tension check. It had been years since she touched a weapon, but the rhythm returned, like a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lucas stood at the top of the stairs, silent. She didn't turn. "Close the door," she said softly. He obeyed, then walked down slowly, watching her work with wide, alert eyes. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. By the following day, the field behind the barn had transformed. Lucas carried fence wire and bundled stakes while Sarah marked angles with a compass and notched flagging tape along the high brush. She taught him how to identify cover versus concealment, how to walk a fence line without leaving a trail, how to wire a silent alarm from old motion detectors and scrap radio parts. They built a low wall of sandbags near the root cellar, shielding it from view with a broken livestock trough and stacked logs that looked accidental. When dusk fell, they walked the perimeter together, and Lucas carried the flashlight without needing to be asked. Pastor David Monroe arrived at the farm 2 days later, uninvited. His truck rattled into the gravel lot just after noon, carrying an old tool chest and a quiet sense of purpose. Sarah met him on the porch, her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her boots caked in red clay. He didn't mention the noose or the town or the silence. He just said, "You're preparing." She nodded once. "Let me help," he added. She didn't respond. But when she turned and walked back to the barn, she didn't close the door behind her. That evening, he returned with 5 more, men she recognized from service photos posted years ago in the church hallway. One had a limp that slowed him but didn't stop him. Another carried a rucksack stitched with patches so faded their colors barely held. They didn't ask for orders. They found tools, gloves, rope, and positions without being told. By the time the sun disappeared behind the trees, the barn had taken on a new shape, not just a storage space, but a staging ground. The rafters echoed with the sound of boots and drills, the slap of canvas, the thump of gear hitting packed dirt. Sarah showed Lucas how to bury a tripwire along the creek bed, how to mark fallback routes on a hand-drawn map, how to read the land's breath by the way the wind turned a single blade of grass. He listened without speaking. His hands trembled on the first wire coil. She steadied them with hers. Inside the barn, a rusted iron cross hung from a nail near the hayloft ladder. No one had touched it in years, but it swayed slightly in the night air, catching the lantern light with every pass. One of the veterans, a man with silver stubble and dark eyes, paused beneath it for a long moment before continuing toward the supply table. Sarah slept little that week. She lay on the couch with her boots still on, waking every few hours to check the monitors, mark the motion logs, scan for footprints along the east tree line. At dawn, she walked the fields alone, her shadow long across the cold dirt. She didn't carry the rifle during those walks. Not yet. It remained in the barn, resting across 2 sawhorses, its presence enough. Lucas grew quieter as the week went on, but more precise. He asked about angles. He asked about timing. When she corrected his grip during an airsoft drill, he didn't flinch or complain. He nodded once and tried again. His drone sketches moved from concept to practical build sheets, drawn in fine pen and taped along the barn's west wall like mission boards. Sarah spoke little to the others. There were no strategy meetings, no ego in the air, just tasks, split without hierarchy. One man patched a breach in the fence. Another reinforced the well cover with steel mesh. Monroe worked quietly on communication shortwave bands, encrypted backups, spare batteries soldered with a hand steadier than most surgeons. The barn no longer smelled of hay and motor oil. It smelled of readiness. Everything had its place: a charging station for headlamps, a rack of field rations, rows of bottled water and coiled wire. Even the hayloft had been swept, repurposed into an elevated lookout with a spotting scope and a silent chair positioned to face the creek. Nothing about it felt like a militia. There were no flags, no speeches, just the hum of preparation, the slow rhythm of people who had built defenses before and remembered what it cost not to. On the fifth night, as the temperature dropped and frost crept along the edges of the eastern pasture, Sarah stood beside Lucas at the sandbag wall. He handed her a coil of wire without being told. She looped it over one arm, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Why now?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the brush like a whisper. "Because they think we won't," she said at last. "So we will." The words settled between them like stone. Neither moved. The stars overhead were dim, but steady, and in the barn behind them, the cross still swayed, silent and unbroken. The wind shifted just after midnight. It came low through the tree line, too steady for nature, too deliberate for accident. Sarah felt it before she heard it. A movement in the pattern of air, the way the goats pressed against the fence without sound, the barn cat frozen on the loft beam, its eyes wide and unblinking. From the upper loft of the barn, she scanned the perimeter through her scope. The thermal overlay lit the world in shades of gray and white. Nothing at first. Then a flicker near the south pasture, a shape too low for livestock, too fluid for wind. Another appeared behind the shed, then another. Slow, calculated. She exhaled once, steady and shallow, her finger resting lightly along the trigger guard. Below, Pastor Monroe crouched behind the trench wall, silent, his hand raised in a closed fist signal that traveled like a wave along the defensive line. They came with smoke. Cold plumes rolled through the west field, thick and chemical, designed to blur optics and scatter movement. Sarah adjusted the scope settings, tightening the contrast. Her voice on the radio was a whisper, but it cut clean through static. 3-man staggered entry, south and west, moving on my mark. Down in the grass, Lucas crouched behind the irrigation trench, a makeshift rifle braced against his shoulder, breath tight. He wasn't firing, not yet. He was watching exactly as she had taught him. Wait for the mistake. The first flash came near the broken cedar stump. One of the intruders, wrapped in camo, stepped into the open just long enough to catch the faint shine of moonlight on his lens. Sarah marked him. A soft click. The shot cracked like breath, suppressed and exact. He dropped, silent. A second figure rushed forward from cover, raising a short-barrel rifle toward the trench. Monroe's signal flashed. The men responded without noise, redirecting fire just long enough to pin the flank. Sarah swept right and dropped the second man with a shot to the shoulder. Non-lethal. Deliberate. They would find his vest later and know it had been precision, not panic. From the brush near the creek, Lucas shifted to reposition. The movement was clean, but too close to an advancing unit. Sarah saw the barrel come up from behind a tree aimed directly at her son. She didn't think. She adjusted 1 centimeter, sighted, and fired. The round struck the man in the neck. He slumped backward before his finger could close on the trigger. Lucas dropped flat, mud sliding across his arm. He didn't scream, didn't freeze. He crawled back behind the stone well and reached for the field radio. In the loft, Sarah's scope swept to the right. The spotter had appeared 300 yards east, perched just beyond the line of cover, guiding the team through thermal relay. He wore a mask with an integrated lens pack and a shoulder antenna blinking every 3 seconds. She tracked his breathing, watched the rise of his shoulder, waited until the moment he leaned forward to relay a signal, then fired. The round hit just below the ear. The relay pack fizzled out. The light died. Below, the attacking line wavered. The trench volunteers moved in silence, adjusting to flank coverage. One dragged a smokescreen canister across the lower slope, letting the wind carry it back toward the barn. It thickened quickly, blinding the entry path and forcing the assault team to collapse inward. Inside the smoke, Sarah's radio crackled. "Moving up from the north," Monroe said calmly. "We've got 6 holding, 2 injured." Sarah didn't answer. She was already calculating. A figure stumbled through the fog near the barn's eastern wall. He moved fast, too fast, breaking formation. He thought the smoke gave him cover. Sarah leaned out just far enough to catch the motion. His weapon swept upward. She fired once. His knees buckled. He went down hard. Another tried to drag him back but froze when he saw her silhouette above. For a second, their eyes locked through fog and failing optics. His face twisted not in pain, but in confusion. He raised his hands. She didn't fire. He dropped his weapon and ran. The rest followed. Not all at once. Not with noise. But in the shuddering collapse of a formation undone by precision. They broke in pairs, then in singles, fading into the smoke. Their retreat marked by the soft crackle of comms going dead and footsteps too fast to be measured. Lucas climbed up from the trench, eyes scanning. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "Steady. Status." He answered between breaths. "I'm okay. Took cover. Saw everything." In the loft. She didn't move from her post. Her body still aligned with the rifle. Her breathing even. But her hands were loose now, resting lightly on the wood. The field below shimmered with fog and moonlight. The silence after the firefight wasn't clean. It buzzed with heat and smoke and what could have been. A cracked radio lay beside her. It had taken a round early on, the casing dented, the frequency scrambled. She'd switched to hand signals after that, and still the coordination held. Down below, Monroe made his way toward the barn, flanked by 2 volunteers carrying spare med kits. He looked up into the loft, eyes sharp. "You saved him," he said. Sarah didn't respond. She just rested the rifle across her knees and let the silence speak. By dawn, the field was still again. Spent casings lay scattered like seeds, and the east tree line held no more movement. One of the men from Flynn's team had left behind a field map tucked into his vest pocket, laminated, marked in red. Her land had been labeled Sector 9. The notation beside it read, "Clear by force if needed." Sarah folded the map and placed it on the table beside the barn's iron cross. She didn't speak about the fight. Not to Lucas. Not to the others. She just walked the perimeter again that morning. Alone. Checking the tripwires. Scanning the sky. She didn't celebrate. Didn't mourn. She prepared. Because what they thought was silence had always been discipline. And what they thought was a mother on a farm was a soldier, holding the line. The morning after the firefight, Sarah laid out everything on the barn table, the field map pulled from a retreating scout's vest, a captured radio unit with its last transmission still blinking, and a flash drive found in a rucksack left behind at the south fence line. Pastor Monroe brought in a second file, one he had compiled over the last 6 weeks, zoning overlays, development requests, and state-level grant forms that had passed through too many hands too quickly. Together, the pieces formed a pattern quiet, calculated, and deliberate. Prosper Field Holdings was stamped on nearly every document, It was registered as a nonprofit rural revitalization trust, complete with a mission statement about preserving land and empowering struggling communities. On paper, it looked harmless, even generous. But embedded deep in one packet was a contract amendment bearing the signature of Evelyn Drake, a former strategist from a major energy lobbying group. Her name appeared on 3 other grant approvals, all linked to fast-tracked land acquisitions in Ashwood and 2 surrounding counties. In each case, family farms had sold under duress within weeks of a zoning review. Public records showed minimal resistance, no lawsuits, no follow-up. Sarah highlighted every entry by hand, marking sale dates against recorded incidents fires, missing persons reports, vandalism classified as accidents. The match was almost perfect. She packed everything into a folder, nothing digital, only printed copies, certified deeds, and stamped maps. She made 2 sets. One she kept under the floorboard beside her rifle case. The other she carried into town, past the empty courthouse steps, and up to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Leonard Pike was sitting at his desk, sipping coffee and thumbing through paperwork that looked deliberately unimportant. He glanced up when she entered, but didn't stand. I was wondering if you'd come in," he said. His voice held that tone Sarah had heard before, thinly veiled politeness resting on unease. She sat down without asking, placed the folder on his desk. "This is everything," she said. "They weren't just trespassing. They're not just a gang. This is coordinated displacement, shell companies, federal grants, all run through Prosperfield." Pike didn't open the folder right away. His fingers hovered over it, then pulled back. They left equipment, maps, even a target list. My land wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. He nodded slowly, exhaling through his nose. "I've heard things," he said. "Quiet calls, reports that go nowhere, county officials backing out of meetings. But this," he tapped the folder lightly, "this is federal territory. We don't have the resources to poke nests this big." Sarah didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to poke." He looked up. His jaw moved, working around words he didn't want to say. "I'm asking you not to block the road," she said, "not to bury this in the back of a file drawer." He took a slow sip of coffee. It had gone cold. "I have contacts," he said finally. "Reporters, state reps, maybe someone in oversight. But if you take this public, it won't be quiet anymore." Sarah stood. "It's already not quiet." He nodded again, but still didn't open the folder. She watched him for a moment, then turned and left. Behind her, the office remained still. The blinds were drawn halfway. The coffee steamed, then stopped. The folder sat untouched on the desk, its weight not in its paper, but in what it made impossible to ignore. Back at the farm, Sarah walked to the barn and hung a copy of the pipeline map on the back wall. Evelyn Drake's name was printed cleanly in the lower margin, a small approval signature beside a parcel number that matched Sarah's own deed. They hadn't come for the house or the pasture. They'd come to make the story disappear. But the paper would hold. The lines would remain. And Sarah would see to it that every name, every acre, every erased voice was remembered. The first story broke quietly, tucked between weather updates and the local baseball score. A regional journalist named Marie Leland, once laid off from a major outlet for pursuing unmarketable angles, posted a video to her independent blog. It showed drone footage of the Carson property after the assault burned grass, spent casings, smoke still rising from a broken field. Over the images, she overlaid clips from county records, land deed transfers, and grant applications signed by Prosperfield Holdings. Sarah had handed over everything: the laminated maps, the flash drive, the notarized files, and the name Evelyn Drake printed in clean, black ink beside the words Strategic Land Transition Corridor. Leland didn't editorialize. She simply showed what Sarah gave her. It was enough. Within 48 hours, national outlets picked it up. What started as a local land rights report became a federal investigation. State officials scrambled to distance themselves. The Prosperfield website went offline, replaced with a blank maintenance message. Evelyn Drake. Scheduled to speak at a rural investment summit in Raleigh, was intercepted by two plainclothes agents as she stepped off stage. She didn't resist. She simply handed her notes to her assistant and walked toward the waiting vehicle. Her charges were read later that day: racketeering, coercion, conspiracy to defraud, and multiple counts of land seizure fraud under the Federal Property Protection Statute. Garrett Flynn's arrest came quietly but with greater force. He was found at a private security facility in Kentucky, training new recruits. A sting operation captured him on record, describing soft invasions and rural clearance tactics. His team folded almost immediately. Many of them had already left the region after the Carson defense. None of them knew her name until it hit the news. Sarah didn't speak to the press. She didn't respond to interview requests. Leland respected the silence, refusing to publish details about Sarah's military past. What mattered, she said, wasn't what Sarah had done before, but what she had preserved now. At the county land board hearing, Sarah arrived early. She wore the same jacket she used for fencing, the same boots from the barn. Her folder was clean and unadorned. She stood when called, but didn't offer a speech. She placed the restored documents on the table, her family's original deed, the annotated overlays, the state code referencing historic protections. She spoke only once, to confirm that her grandfather's name matched the one on the oldest property map still on file. The board didn't argue. The vote was unanimous. The Carson property was designated a historic family trust. No corporate purchase, development plan, or pipeline easement could challenge its status again. The decision passed with little fanfare, but outside the chamber, reporters waited. None of them approached her. She walked past without slowing, her hands tucked in her jacket, her steps even. In town, reactions came slowly. The feed store clerk nodded once when she passed through for fencing nails. The gas station attendant stopped pretending not to recognize her. People didn't flood her with praise or apologies. They just stepped out of her way a little faster, spoke a little softer, carried a little more weight in their eyes. Lucas returned to school a week later. No one mocked his designs anymore. His drawings had changed too, no longer just drones and circuits, but sketches of watchtowers, field cameras, and a barn rebuilt with reinforced walls. At night, he taped a new sheet to the barn's west wall. It showed the full property, outlined in ink and shaded with green. In one corner, he'd drawn the old sycamore, roots curling deep into the paper. Sarah saw it and said nothing, but when she turned away, she left the light on a little longer. The rifle was cleaned one final time and returned to its case. She locked it, sealed the key in a fireproof envelope, and placed it in a drawer she no longer opened. The maps were stored in a flat box under the floorboard. The documents, now officially stamped and certified, were added to the family ledger alongside her father's name, her grandfather's, and now her own. There was no celebration, no ceremony, just restoration. The fields came back slowly. Grass grew over the tire tracks. The scent of fire faded from the soil. The goats wandered farther from the fence, no longer spooked by every gust. The barn was patched, its new door carved from the same wood as the old. The rusted cross still hung near the loft ladder, untouched. It swayed gently in the breeze, even when no one moved beneath it. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the light turned the fields the color of brass, Sarah walked the fence line with Lucas. He carried his sketchbook under one arm, taller now, his stride nearly matching hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wire was taut. The posts were straight. A new section had been added where the fire had scorched the earth. Sarah ran her hand along the grain of one post, feeling the edge of the wood under her palm. Behind them, the house stood quiet, smoke curling from the chimney, the porch light already glowing faintly against the dusk. Lucas paused and looked back once. Sarah didn't. She kept walking, the wind pushing gently through her hair. the evening settling like dust along the gravel, her boots pressed into the earth, marking a trail her grandfather once walked, her father once watched, her husband once dreamed of passing down. Now it was hers. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in proof. The sky above them dimmed into blue. Somewhere in the trees, a crow called once, then fell silent, and the land, long threatened, long claimed, stood still. It remembered, and so did she. She was never the loudest in the room, never the one looking to prove herself. But when her land was threatened, when her history was nearly erased, Sarah Carson stood with the kind of strength that doesn't need to be seen to be real. She didn't fight for glory. She defended what mattered with silence, precision, and purpose. In a world that often overlooks quiet resilience, she reminded us that true power doesn't announce itself. It endures. It protects. It holds the line until the world can no longer ignore it. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet strength in your own life. Share your thoughts in the comments or follow for more stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of courage that speaks through action, not words. Sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that never have to raise themselves.